After Pyrrhus of Epirus unceremoniously left Sicily in 275 BC, he noted to his entourage, "My friends, what a wrestling ring we are leaving behind for the Carthaginians and the Romans." Although most likely fabricated, his words would prove prophetic. The Phoenicians were an ancient Semitic maritime empire located in the southern Levant on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians succeeded the Canaanites during the late Bronze Age collapse. The name Phoenicia is a Greek term, but it is believed that they refer to themselves as Canaanites, meaning that the Phoenician civilization stretches all the way back to the rise of Canaan in 2500 BC. Two of the greatest Phoenician cities were Tyre and Sidon, both of them being coastal towns with great natural harbors. The Phoenicians were skilled seafarers and they established a vast trade empire across the Mediterranean. They founded a large number of colonies that stretched all the way to Spain and the Atlantic Ocean. Of these colonies, Carthage was by far the greatest. The story goes that the queen of Tyre named Dido, along with some nobles, fled the city and her murderous brother. They sailed west and eventually landed in northwest Africa, where they founded the city of Carthage. The city was then visited by the Roman hero Aeneas, who escaped the fall of Troy. Aeneas seduced the queen, but he was quick to leave the thriving city and continue on his way to Italy. When Dido saw his ships leaving, she cursed him and his descendants, proclaiming endless hate between Carthage and the sons of Troy, before ending her life. Some ancient authors place the founding of Carthage in 1215 BC, meaning before the fall of Troy, but this is very unlikely. The later date given for the founding of the city is 814 BC, and this date is more widely accepted by modern historians. The name Carthage, originally Kart Hadasht, means new city in the Phoenician language. Relatively close to Carthage was Utica, or the Old City, generally believed to be the first Phoenician colony in North Africa. It's believed that these cities had an amicable relationship at the beginning. During the 700s BC, Carthage was just another Phoenician colony in the region. But in the 7th century, Carthage started acting more as an independent entity with a distinct Punic culture. Carthaginians even founded their own colonies, starting with Ibiza in 650 BC. We can safely assume that Carthage was already fully independent when the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered Phoenicia in 572 BC. The Carthaginians were focused on seaward expansion from the get-go. They expanded their influence throughout the Mediterranean by founding new and taking control of the old Phoenician colonies. In the beginning, they had trouble expanding in North Africa, but by the time they entered our story at the start of the 3rd century BCE, their holdings stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west all the way to Egypt in the east. They also controlled the southern part of Spain, Corsica, Sardinia, and crucially, a part of Sicily. Carthage was located on a triangular peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. It was surrounded by a massive 20-mile-long wall supported by 4-story-high watchtowers. The city was dominated by a large circular harbor that could house up to 220 warships, as well as a number of shipbuilding yards. State-of-the-art technologies contained within this harbor were closely guarded state secrets. It was connected to the outer harbor reserved for merchant vessels. The Greek geographer Strabo claims that 700,000 people lived in Carthage, but this included the entire countryside and neighboring towns. At its peak, Carthage probably housed around 400,000 people, including slaves and foreigners. Carthage was an oligarchy controlled by the wealthy elites who formed the Senate. They were dominated by the merchant class, who didn't place an importance on family heritage, but rather on the size of the bank account. This meant that anyone savvy enough to get rich could earn himself a seat in the Senate. The core of the Senate was a special council called the Court of the 104 Judges. As the name implies, it consisted of 104 elders who were in charge of all the laws and justice in Carthage. Each year, the Senate elected 2 special magistrates called the suffets. They were akin to the Roman consuls with one notable exception. The suffets had no military duties. All military command was in the hands of a small panel of generals who would take control of the state in war times. It was a dangerous job being a Carthaginian general. Defeated generals were often executed for their failures, while victorious ones were often seen as a danger to the ruling elites and they were often shunned. The biggest difference between Rome and Carthage was the composition of their armies. Roman legions were manned by Roman citizens themselves, while the Carthaginian army was made exclusively of paid mercenaries. This meant that the Roman soldiers fought wars in defense of their country, while the mercenaries just wanted to be paid. Some historians in the past put this down as the main reason for the eventual Roman victory in the Punic Wars, but this should not be overstated. There were further differences between the two powers, mainly social and religious. The lack of any hereditary aristocracy meant that the Carthaginian populace failed to develop solidarity and collective action. Events such as the secession of the plebs in Rome or popular uprisings common in the Hellenistic world were never recorded. On the other hand, the Punic religion had a sinister side to it. There are surviving accounts of mass ritual sacrifices of noble children to appease the angry god Baal. It was believed that this was just a piece of political propaganda trying to paint the Carthaginians in a bad light. But in the 20th century, a mass grave was found with a damning inscription lying among the burnt remains. It is important to note that most, if not all, surviving records of the Punic Wars were written from the Roman perspective. This means that Carthage is often portrayed in a negative light, with Rome being the power for good. Even the name Punic Wars is derived from the Latin word Punitius, which Romans used as a name for the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians. Out of our ancient sources, Greek historian Polybius is the most trustworthy and objective. The accounts of the First Punic War are shrouded in mystery. They were described by Polybius long after their conclusion, using often contradictory primary sources that heavily favored the Romans. His account of the Second Punic War is the most complete and detailed of the three. He interviewed men who were part of the war and found a number of primary sources, such as letters and documents from that time. During his time in Rome, he was patronized by Scipio Aemilianus. He followed him during his campaigns, meaning that Polybius actually took part in the Third Punic War. Unfortunately, his account of the war is lost to history. Instead, our most complete source is Appian of Alexandria, who extensively used Polybius for his writings. On the other side of the Mediterranean stood Rome. During the 300s BC, Romans fought a series of grueling wars with the Samnites. Although they found themselves in mortal peril several times, the Romans emerged victorious at the start of the 3rd century BC. During this time, they grew from a chief city in Latium to a dominating power in Italy. These expansions brought them into contact with the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia. A capable Greek commander, Pyrrhus of Epirus, sailed from mainland Greece to aid the colonies against the Romans. After some difficulties, Pyrrhus was defeated and the Romans expanded their influence over the whole of southern Italy. Following this victory, the Romans were finally recognized as a major power on the international stage. After consolidating their influence in the newly acquired territories, they were again on the lookout for new conquests. An opportunity arose when Picentes, a small tribe just north of Roman borders, rebelled against unwanted incursions from the legions. Thus the Picentine War started in 269 BC. They were a small tribe and never stood a chance against Rome. A consular army was raised, and after a single decisive battle, the Picentes were crushed and had to sue for peace. Their territory was annexed and eventually Romanized. In 265 BC, a slave revolt erupted in Etruscan town Volsini. The ruling elites asked Rome for help and a consul was sent with his army. He tried to take the city by storm, but he was killed in the attempt. The next year, the town was taken by siege and the leaders of the revolt were executed. It's believed that the prisoners from Volsini were a part of the first ever gladiatorial battles in Rome in 264 BC. The details of the final conquest of Etruria are shrouded in mystery, but we can be certain that on the eve of the First Punic War in 264 BCE, Rome controlled everything, from the Greek cities in the south all the way to the river Arno in the north. There aren't many inevitabilities in history, but a number of scholars argue that a clash between Rome and Carthage, the two dominant powers in the region, was bound to happen sooner or later. We should now look towards Sicily and the spark that would engulf the Mediterranean in a series of conflicts lasting over a century. Agathocles of Syracuse was a tyrant ruling over a powerful Greek colony in Sicily. He came to power in 317 BCE when he took the city with an army of mercenaries. He would go on to rule uncontested until his death in 289 BC. His career was marked by constant wars with Carthage for supremacy over Sicily. During one of these wars, he invited a group of mercenaries from Campania called the Mamertines. After Agathocles died, the Mamertines found themselves without a job in a foreign land and they decided to return to Italy. On their way back, they came across a small trading town called Messana. Deceiving the inhabitants, they entered the town and took it from the inside. Messana was then transformed from a small trading outpost to a raiding base. The mercenaries did the only thing they knew. They would pillage the countryside, raid nearby towns, and capture passing merchant ships. In 275 BC, a young despot Hiero took control of Syracuse. By 270, he was fed up with the Mamertines and the nuisance they caused. He raised an army and marched towards Messana. He defeated the Mamertines in a battle. This, however, was not enough to stop them, and he set siege to the city in 265 BC. The Mamertines sent envoys to Carthage and asked for aid. The Carthaginians could not pass up on an opportunity to expand their influence on Sicily. As a bonus, control of Messana brings with it control of the shortest route to Italy. An army station in Sicily was sent to garrison Messana, and the Carthaginian commander took control of the city. Hiero didn't want to risk open conflict with Carthage, and he retreated back to Syracuse. The Mamertines quickly regretted their decision and grew resentful of their new overlords. They appealed to Rome for help in expelling this garrison. In Rome, the Senate could not agree on how to proceed. On the one side, there was the Fabii family who had interests in the north and argued for northern expansion towards the Po Valley. On the other side, there was the Claudii family who had interests in the south and argued for action in Sicily. The discussion boiled down to the two main arguments. During the Pyrrhic War, Rhegium, a city in Italy lying on the other side of the Straits of Messina, asked Rome for help. A garrison of 4,000 Campanians was sent to defend the city. They were inspired by their countrymen in Messana and took control of the city. The Senate could not allow such disobedience, and an army was sent in 271 BCE to deal with the rebels. Rhegium was taken and most of the garrison was killed. 300 surviving men were marched to Rome and publicly executed. The Fabii family argued that helping the Mamertines while crushing their counterparts in Rhegium just a few years prior would expose Roman hypocrisy. The Claudii family argued that it would be too dangerous to let Carthage take control of Messana and eventually the whole of Sicily. This would give them an easy route into Italy and put their Greek subjects in danger. Furthermore, they argued that Carthage was preoccupied in Spain at the time and they wouldn't risk open war with Rome. The senators couldn't agree, and in the end, the decision was passed down to the people. A promise of new riches awaiting them in Sicily sealed the deal, and the people elected Appius Claudius Caudex as one of the consuls. Appius needed some time to raise an army and secure the ships that would carry them into Sicily. In the meantime, he sent an expeditionary force commanded by his cousin, Gaius Claudius, to secure the crossing and make all the necessary preparations. While trying to cross the Straits of Messina, they were rebuffed by the Carthaginian fleet that was patrolling the area. Hoping that a show of force was enough to deter the Romans from coming into Sicily, the Carthaginians released the prisoners and returned the captured ships. Rather than falling back, Gaius used the cover of darkness and crossed the straits during the night. He immediately opened the negotiations with the Mamertines while he was waiting for the rest of the Roman army. When Appius finally arrived, he also crossed during the night and all of his force was safely in Sicily. Polybius never mentions Gaius, and it's unclear what the real sequence of the events was. Modern historians question the existence of another commander conveniently named Claudius. What is clear is that all sides were trying to avoid open conflict. There was a great deal of negotiation between the three sides. From this, an unlikely alliance between Carthage and Syracuse was formed. The Mamertines sided with the Romans, forcing the Carthaginian commander to withdraw from the city. When he reported this news to the Senate, he was promptly executed for failing to defend Carthaginian interests, and an army was sent into Sicily. In the meantime, Hiero led an army from Syracuse and blockaded the Romans in Messana. Appius was trying to avoid conflict and negotiate with Hiero. But when the negotiations failed, Appius charged out with his men and lifted the siege of the city. Hiero had to retreat all the way back to Syracuse and prepare the defenses of the city. Appius then drove off a small Carthaginian force from the area. Having secured Messana, he marched towards Syracuse and plundered the countryside along the way. This was no more than a show of force, as he had no way of taking the city without naval support. When the campaigning season ended, Appius was recalled back to Rome. Next year, both consuls with full consular armies were sent to Messana. It's clear that the Senate now saw Sicily as a strategically important target. The two consuls marched south towards Syracuse. A number of Greek cities along the way pleaded their allegiance to Rome. These cities would stay loyal to Rome for the duration of the war. On the other hand, the alliance between Carthage and Hiero was short-lived. When the consuls appeared near Syracuse, Hiero quickly changed sides and allied with the Romans instead. They would in turn guarantee his safety and an exclusive zone of influence in Sicily. He would stay loyal to Rome for the rest of his long life, and his support proved crucial during the First Punic War. The Romans were no great sailors, and without Hiero, they would be unable to supply their armies on Sicily. All pieces were now in position, and the First Punic War had started in earnest. The Mamertines would eventually fade from history, their final fate still unknown. Roman historian Dio Cassius explains that Messana was no more than a pretext. The First Punic War was the result of selfish interests on both sides. The Romans and the Carthaginians alike believed that their power would intimidate the other side into stepping down, and if that failed, they believed in a quick victory on the field as a result of their superiority. These beliefs dragged them into a costly conflict that would go on to last 24 years. The Second Punic War is famous for brilliant leadership on both sides. Hannibal Barca and Scipio Africanus inspire awe to this day. Their tactics and maneuvers are discussed and studied even today. In contrast, the First Punic War was marked by terrible leadership. Both sides had several costly blunders. Wrong decisions made out of selfish interests and plain incompetence were all too common during the war. After these initial skirmishes that went in Roman favor, neither side was willing to back down. The Carthaginians started enlisting a great number of mercenaries, mainly from Spain, with additional troops provided by the Gauls and the Ligurians. They also enlisted help from the Numidian cavalry, a mainstay of the Punic Wars. In 262 BC, the Romans again sent both consuls with full consular armies into Sicily. Each consular army was made up of 2 legions and 2 alii, or allied legions. Each legion was comprised of 4,200 infantry and 300 cavalry, with each soldier being a Roman citizen. The alii were somewhat larger, with 5,100 infantry and 900 cavalry each. Roman allies provided all the manpower for the alii. This meant that the 2 consuls commanded roughly 40,000 men in total. Meanwhile, in Syracuse, Hiero was stockpiling resources in anticipation of a long campaign. The Romans started moving west, and a large number of settlements in central Sicily joined their side. The Carthaginians chose Agrigentum as their base of operations, but when the Roman armies reached the city in the summer of 262, most of the troops hadn't yet arrived and the city was poorly defended. The consuls marched together, and when they reached the city, they found that the surrounding fields were deserted. Commander of Agrigentum, Hannibal Gisco, no relation to the famous Hannibal, ordered all villagers to abandon their homes and take refuge behind the city walls. The population of Agrigentum had swollen to 50,000, but the garrison was relatively small in comparison. The Roman army encamped about a mile from the city. It just so happened that it was the middle of the harvesting season, and luckily the Roman army was composed mostly of small farmers. They were still unable to supply large armies so far away from home, and they were already running low on supplies. The Romans seized the opportunity and scattered around the fields to gather as much food as they could find. Hannibal, seeing that the Roman camp was poorly defended, rushed outside of the city hoping to catch them off guard. The foragers couldn't offer any resistance to the Carthaginians, and they scattered, leaving the path to the camp wide open. According to an old Roman tradition, a small token force was placed outside of the camp. These men were oath-bound to keep their position, with death awaiting any man who dared to leave his post. Although heavily outnumbered, the token force managed to hold their ground and even rebuffed the attackers. The Romans then chased them all the way back to the city, inflicting further casualties on the small garrison. Following this altercation, both sides changed their approach. The Romans were much more wary of raiding parties in the future, and the foragers were escorted by a large force. On the other hand, Hannibal couldn't risk further losses to his garrison, and he refused to leave the protection of his walls. In ancient warfare, there were a couple of ways of taking a city. The first, and by far the easiest, was by treachery. Often a group or a single person unhappy with the current leadership would aid the attackers with their assault, leaving the defenders dumbfounded. Such betrayals were surprisingly common in the fickle world of city-state politics. According to some accounts, as many as half the cities taken during the Punic Wars involved some kind of treachery. If there was no disgruntled party in the city, the attackers were left with 2 options. They could either storm the city or besiege it. Taking the city by storm was a perilous affair, and the casualties were abundant. The defenders held the upper hand and could protect the city with far fewer men. Attackers had to use ladders or later siege towers to climb the walls, while they were showered with arrows and stones from above. Conversely, they could try to break open the doors with battering rams, or dig underneath the walls to circumvent them altogether. The Romans would eventually master all of these approaches, but for now they lacked the means and the know-how to take a city as large as Agrigentum. That meant that they were forced into the third and final approach, besieging the city. Luckily, Agrigentum wasn't a port town, as the Romans lacked the naval power required to blockade the port. The Romans encircled Agrigentum and built 2 camps on opposite sides, with each council commanding 1 camp. They built 2 sets of fortifications, one to defend them from any advances from the city, and the other to defend them from any army coming to aid the city. Guards were posted along the whole perimeter in order to stop any attempts of resupplying the city from the outside. The besiegers had to hold out until the city ran out of food and surrendered. Roman allies were in charge of providing supplies and other materials needed for sustaining the siege. Small nearby town Herbessus was chosen as a supply base, and all the resources were gathered there. For 5 months the 2 sides were at a stalemate. Agrigentum was running low on supplies, and Hannibal sent messengers pleading for urgent aid. The Carthaginians were amassing their forces in Heraclea Minoa under the leadership of Hanno. Diodorus claims that Hanno commanded 50,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 60 war elephants, giving him a numerical advantage over the Romans. Instead of engaging the Romans directly, Hanno opted for taking Herbessus and all the supplies stored there. This put the Roman army in a dire situation. Soon the troops grew exhausted and malnourished, with diseases starting to spread. They would even have to lift the siege and pull back, were it not for Hiero, who managed to supply the armies with great effort. Seeing that the time was ripe for an assault, Hanno advanced from Heraclea. He ordered his Numidian cavalry to engage the Romans and then fall back to the rest of the army. When the Numidians reached the Roman camp, the cavalry rushed out and a small skirmish was fought.
Have at thee!
The Numidians then retreated with Romans in hot pursuit. When they reached the rest of the Punic force, the Numidians turned around and encircled the Romans. A great number of men were killed, with the rest retreating back to the camp. When Hanno reached Agrigentum, he constructed his camp about a mile away from the Romans. For 2 months nothing changed, as both sides were avoiding open conflict. Eventually, the famine in Agrigentum forced Carthaginians to act, and the Romans, who were themselves on the verge of starvation, happily answered the challenge. The Romans marched out in a conventional 3-line formation adopted during the Samnite Wars. Hanno organized his men into 2 lines, with the second line acting as a reserve. He placed the elephants in the second line. The cavalry of both sides was presumably placed on the wings. A long and grueling battle was fought, and in the end, the Punic first line was broken and put to flight. This unorganized retreat broke the resolve of the second line, and they too joined the flight. In this commotion, the elephants were scared, and the Carthaginians lost control. It's reported that most of the elephants, along with Hanno's camp, were captured by the Romans. When the night fell, the Romans, exhausted by the battle and subsequent celebrations, failed to post sentries. Hannibal and the remnants of his small garrison snuck outside of the city and fled to Heraclea. In the morning, the Romans entered Agrigentum unopposed. The city was plundered, and a great number of men was sold into slavery. According to Diodorus, the Carthaginians lost 3,000 men, with a further 4,000 captured, while the Romans lost as many as 30,000. But this is out of 100,000 men who were part of the siege of Agrigentum. Despite these staggering numbers, the Battle of Agrigentum was a great Roman success. According to Polybius, it convinced the Senate to expand their war aims from simply securing Messana to completely expelling the Carthaginians from Sicily. To accomplish this, the Romans would have to build a great naval fleet. Although Hanno is often criticized for his use of elephants, we shouldn't be too harsh on him. This is the first recorded instance of elephants being used by the Carthaginians in battle. Perhaps they haven't yet developed the best tactics for utilizing the great beasts. He is also criticized for his failure to control the 2 lines, but we should note that Hanno was commanding a force of fresh recruits. His mercenaries were a mix of multiple nationalities, and they would yet have to learn to cooperate. This battle was one of only 2 pitched battles fought in Sicily in the 24 years of the First Punic War. The rugged terrain of the island is unsuitable for maneuvering large armies. In contrast to the Second Punic War, which was marked by several large-scale battles, the First Punic War was mostly a series of sieges from both sides. Sicily was dotted with a great number of walled cities that controlled the surrounding areas. These cities were the key to taking Sicily. This meant that fighting a pitched battle carried many risks with it, while it would provide only a limited gain for the victors. A large number of troops employed by both sides had to be stationed inside the cities as garrisons, and they couldn't be used in open battles. The war in Sicily was now grounded to a halt. The Romans held superiority on land, and many inland cities sided with them, while the Carthaginians were unchallenged on the sea and many port towns sided with them instead. Frequent Punic raids in Italy put a further strain on Rome. It was now clear that the Romans would have to take to the seas. While first crossing to Messana, the Romans had to borrow ships from their allies, namely Tarentum, Naples and Locri. This just shows how the Romans were unprepared for this undertaking. Luckily, during that crossing, one of the Carthaginian ships that was patrolling the area ventured too close to shore and ran aground. The Romans captured this ship and studied it in order to make copies. This was one of the quinqueremes, the top-of-the-line ship of the ancient Mediterranean. The name quinquereme is Latin for 5 oars, but this is a misnomer. The oars were not arranged in groups of 5, but rather the oarsmen. Oars were placed in sets of 3, one above the other. 2 men controlled each of the top 2 oars, with 1 man controlling the bottom oar. Quinquereme had a crew of 300 rowers with a further 120 men positioned on deck. The ships were equipped with metal rams placed on the bow at sea level. The primary tactic used in sea battles at the time was ramming enemy ships, breaking their hulls and sinking them. This meant that the crews had to be exceedingly skilled in maneuvering the ships. All ancient vessels were somewhat unstable and vulnerable to bad weather. The Romans will soon learn this the hard way. After studying the shipwreck, the Senate ordered 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes, a smaller but more nimble variant built. Although inexperienced at first, the Roman carpenters and woodworkers would soon get used to producing these large ships, and their quality steadily increased. It's unclear where this Herculean task took place, but some authors placed it in Ostia, close to direct supervision from Rome. While the ships were under construction, the Romans recruited 30,000 men and trained them as sailors. Polybius recounts the story of Romans sitting on dry land arranged as if they were on actual ships. They were then trained to swing their bodies back and forth in unison, with their hands mimicking the position of the oars. According to Pliny, the entire fleet was ready in just 60 days. For the first time in 260 BC, the Romans set sail with their armada, commanded by Consul Admiral Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio. During the Samnite Wars and the Pyrrhic War, the Romans showed great resilience. After each defeat, the Romans would come back stronger. Losing entire armies was just a minor setback for them. These wars were somewhat defensive in nature, and the Romans showed that Rome would stand as long as there were Romans who could carry arms. With this fleet, their capacity for aggressive expansion was put on full display. Furthermore, the construction of an entire fleet from a single captured shipwreck is another instance of Roman adaptability. Each time that the Romans faced mightier opponents, they would study the tactics and equipment used by their enemies and adopt them, eventually even surpassing them. While waiting for the rest of the fleet, Scipio led an advance party of 17 ships to make preparations in Messana. On his way there, he heard a rumor that the citizens of Lipara were ready to betray the Punic garrison stationed there. Lipara was the most important port in the small group of islands lying north of Sicily. These islands held great strategic importance as they controlled the crossing from Italy to Sicily. Hoping to score an easy victory, Scipio sailed his small squadron to Lipara and occupied the harbor. At the time, Hannibal Gisco was positioned in Panormus with his fleet. When he heard the news of the Roman fleet, he sent 20 of his own ships. They arrived at night and trapped the Romans inside the harbor. Some of the inexperienced sailors panicked and abandoned the ships. Those who remained couldn't offer any meaningful resistance, and Scipio, along with his officers, was captured. For his failures, Scipio was given the nickname Asina, meaning donkey. This nickname was doubly insulting, considering that Asina was the feminine form of the word. Despite this, Scipio was later ransomed and served again as consul in 254. Not to be outdone by his Roman counterpart, Hannibal soon fell into a trap of his own. While carrying out a reconnaissance mission, he and his fleet rounded the tip of the Italian boot and stumbled upon the whole of the Roman navy. Carthaginians lost most of their 50 ships, but Hannibal managed to escape. These small setbacks did nothing to deter either side from seeking a greater engagement on the seas. Although victorious, the Romans realized that neither their ships nor their men were capable of fighting the Punic fleet head-on. Ramming maneuvers were difficult to perform on the sea, and the Carthaginians with their long naval tradition could easily outmaneuver the Romans. On the other hand, the Romans were masters of land warfare, and the Carthaginian sailors had no chance if faced with a trained legionnaire. So naturally, someone in the Roman ranks got the bright idea of turning naval warfare into a regular land engagement. Every Roman ship was equipped with an 11-meter-long wooden drawbridge named Corvus, meaning raven. One side of the Corvus was fixed to the ship's bow, while the other side was fitted with a large metal spike. The Corvus could rotate freely around the front of the ship, and when an enemy vessel approached, the Romans would drop it on the unsuspecting target. The large spike would then penetrate the deck of the ship and lodge itself in, creating a bridge between the two ships. Marines stationed on the deck would then quickly cross the bridge and attack the poorly equipped sailors. Although the Corvus saw spectacular success during the First Punic War, it would be retired even before its conclusion. With years, the Roman sailors would gain enough experience and their naval tactics would improve, rendering the Corvus obsolete. The inventor of the Corvus was lost to history, but it's believed that he was Sicilian Greek. Possibly even the young Archimedes, who was 27 at the time, but there is no more than circumstantial evidence for this. When the second consul, Gaius Duilius, got news of Asina's failure, he abandoned his land forces and took control of the armada. The Romans were now eager to put the Corvus to the test, and when they heard the news of the Carthaginian navy plundering the countryside near Mylae, they rushed off to meet them. The Carthaginians were as eager as the Romans for the fight, believing that their superior experience would prevail. When they spotted the Romans on the horizon, the whole fleet, numbering 130 warships, charged without hesitation. Hannibal sailed at the head of the fleet, commanding a large flagship that was captured from King Pyrrhus years earlier. The Carthaginians didn't bother to sail in formation, but rather raced each other, wanting to be the first to make contact with the Romans. Although the Carthaginians were confused by the appearance of the Corvus, they sailed on, not suspecting anything. The first line quickly reached the Romans, and even though some of them were rammed, each Carthaginian ship was successfully hit with a Corvus. Marines quickly swarmed the immobilized vessels and took them with ease. All 30 ships that first made contact were taken. Seeing what had happened, the rest of the fleet panicked. They swung around and tried to ram Roman ships from the sides. But this too was unsuccessful, as the Corvus was easily rotated and every Punic ship that got too close was hit. Once hit, they quickly fell to the Marines. Realizing that they were utterly outmatched, the surviving ships turned around and fled. Even though the flagship was one of the first to fall to the Roman Corvus, Hannibal escaped yet again. The Battle of Mylae, the first real naval engagement between the Romans and the Carthaginians, was a spectacular Roman victory. Out of the 130 Punic ships, 50 were sunk or captured. The greatest navy of the Mediterranean was defeated by a Roman fleet created only months prior, and all thanks to the ingenuity of the Raven. A victory column commemorating this battle was erected in the Forum by Duilius. The inscription on the column, which survives in fragments to this day, praises Duilius in the usual boastful manner of the aristocracy. Despite this outstanding victory, Duilius never again held military command. Hannibal was once again spared execution, but his streak of good fortune was at an end. 2 years later, he led a fleet to Sardinia, but he was blockaded there by the Romans and lost a large number of ships. His men finally mutinied and executed him on the beach. Victory at Mylae reinvigorated the Romans, and it was followed by a string of victories in Sicily. The Roman fleet now changed focus from engaging the Carthaginians to aiding the land armies in Sicily. It was only by chance that the two fleets clashed again in 257. The fleets were sailing off the coast of Sicily near Tyndaris, probably unaware of each other's movements. The consul Gaius Atilius Regulus was sailing in front of the rest of his fleet with a squadron of 10 ships, and when they spotted the Carthaginians, they rushed forth to meet them. Although taken by surprise, the Carthaginian navy had a numerical advantage and 9 out of the 10 Roman ships were sunk. Only the consul, standing on the fastest and best manned vessel, managed to escape. It was now turn for the Carthaginians to overextend, and they engaged the rest of the Roman fleet. 10 Punic ships were captured and 8 were sunk. The rest of the fleet was unwilling to commit to a large-scale battle, and they withdrew to Lipari. We should now return to the land forces waging war in Sicily. The Romans continued their tradition of electing new consuls each year. These consuls would then take over command of the armies from their predecessors. On the other hand, the Carthaginians were much more pragmatic about their military command. Hanno, who led the Punic army in the Battle of Agrigentum, was replaced by Hamilcar. This was not the famous Hamilcar Barca, who would soon enter this story. The Carthaginian commanders would stay in power for years on end, gaining valuable experience and the trust of the army. It's unclear if each Roman consul brought with him a new batch of fresh troops, or if the troops campaigned on Sicily for several years at a time. What is certain is that Romans had deployed much more troops on the island than their Punic counterparts. Each year the Roman casualties were easily replaced by fresh recruits, while the Carthaginian generals often lacked the necessary manpower and their losses were harder to replace. When Hamilcar took control of the land armies in 259, he quickly scored two notable victories. Due to a disagreement between the Romans and their allies, the two armies separated. The smaller allied army, of about 6,000 men, was encamped far from the main force. Hamilcar learned of this and brought his whole force onto the Roman allies. Some 4,000 men were killed. He then proceeded to take the cities of Camarina and Enna that sided with Rome back in 263. A small fraction of the population in each city defected and admitted his armies inside the city walls. This, however, was short-lived, as next year Enna again defected back to the Romans, while Camarina was taken by siege. The Romans were improving their siege techniques, but they were still no match for the Hellenistic armies, who excelled in siegecraft. It's possible that Hiero provided siege engines and experts needed for this undertaking. The Carthaginian army was wintering in Panormus, waiting for the next campaigning season. The Roman commanders brought their entire army in front of the city, but the Carthaginians refused to fight. Unable to take such a large city, the Romans abandoned the siege and proceeded to take several other smaller towns in the area. Seeing that the war couldn't be ended in the rugged terrain of Sicily, the Romans opted for a more radical approach. Lucius Manlius Vulso and Marcus Atilius Regulus were elected consuls in 256 BC. Realizing that there was no way of winning the war in Sicily, they decided to mount a full-scale invasion of Africa and attack Carthage itself. For this, the seas would have to be cleared and the crossing to Africa secured. To this end, the Romans constructed a massive fleet numbering 330 warships in total. The fleet set sail from Italy with close to 100,000 oarsmen powering the ships. They crossed to Messana and continued south along the Sicilian coast. They sailed past Syracuse, rounded the tip of Sicily, and reached the main Roman host station near Cape Ecnomus. The best of the Roman infantry was chosen to board the ships, and each quinquereme was carrying 120 marines in addition to 300 oarsmen already on board. The Carthaginians saw this as an existential threat and gathered an even larger force determined to stop the invasion. 350 ships with more than 150,000 men on board, the largest fleet ever assembled by the city, sailed from Africa to Lilybaeum and then to Heraclea Minoa. These astronomical numbers are provided by Polybius. A grand total of 680 ships and 290,000 men would make the Battle of Cape Ecnomus possibly the largest naval battle in history. Although some later battles from the First and Second World Wars come close in terms of the total number of men, there is no battle that can match it in sheer scale. Polybius himself best describes the magnitude of the battle. It must have been amazing to have witnessed it all in person, but it is hardly less astonishing even for someone who only reads about it and judges the magnitude of the risk to either side and the scale of their armament and resources, just from the number of men and ships. Some modern scholars reject these numbers. It was customary for the ancient authors to inflate the numbers in order to embellish the achievements of the winning side. The scholars analyzed the number of ships available to each side in the years prior to the First Punic War and concluded that neither side could have access to upwards of 300 ships. But we have to remember that the First Punic War was the largest naval conflict of antiquity, and considerable resources from both sides were redirected to expand naval capabilities. Polybius was a Greek historian, and unlike his Roman counterparts, whose main goal was to glorify Roman exploits, Polybius put utmost care to present a real version of events. To this end, he used sources written from the Carthaginian perspective that are lost to history. That is why, in the absence of better literary sources, we tend to lean towards the numbers provided by Polybius. One thing that he was probably mistaken on was the number of men in the Carthaginian navy. He assumed that all Punic ships carried as many men as the Roman quinqueremes, and from this, he arrived at the number of 150,000 sailors. Considering that some of the ships were smaller triremes that could carry fewer men, and that the ships boarded by Roman marines were easily taken, we can surmise that there were somewhat fewer men on the Carthaginian side than actually reported. But whatever the actual numbers were, we can be certain that the upcoming battle was truly a spectacle of naval warfare. All pieces now in position, the Romans set sail along the coast of Sicily. Unaware of the strong Carthaginian presence, the Romans were prepared for both a naval engagement and a landing in Africa. Part of the fleet were the horse transports towed by large warships. The true number of horses is unknown, but during the later campaign in Africa, Regulus had access to at least 500 cavalry. On the other hand, the Carthaginians were focused purely on fighting at sea. Aware of their weak position in Libya, they were reluctant to let the Romans cross the sea. The Romans arranged their fleet in 4 different divisions, known as squadrons 1 to 4. The first 2 squadrons formed a simple wedge, with each consul commanding one side and their larger flagships. The third squadron completed a triangle with the first 2. Ships in the third were towing horse transports. Behind them, the fourth squadron was arranged in a straight line extending on either side of the third squadron. From this, we can surmise that the fourth squadron was more numerous than the first 3. They protected the rear of the formation and acted as the ultimate reserve. This fourth line was nicknamed the Triarii, taking their name from the last line of the Roman land forces. It's clear that in these few short years that the Romans were involved in naval warfare, their crews and tactics improved significantly. Polybius even praises the practicality of the formation. It was dense enough to protect them from ramming, but loose enough to easily maneuver. On the other hand, the Carthaginians were formed up in a single straight line. But upon seeing the Roman positioning, they split up their force in hopes of breaking the Roman formation. Hamilcar, commander of the Sicilian forces, was positioned in the middle. His plan was to retreat after first making contact with the enemy. The Romans would then hopefully chase after him, breaking their tight formation. His left wing, the one closest to the Sicilian shore, broke off from the rest of the Punic line and sailed close to land, aiming to strike the Romans from the side. Hanno was commanding the fastest ships in the fleet positioned on the right wing. They were extended past the Roman formation, hoping to envelop them once the battle started. The plan was to turn the battle into a series of smaller encounters in which the Carthaginians could use their superior ramming skills. When the Romans spotted the loose formation of the Carthaginian center, they perceived that as a weakness and rushed in to meet them. As instructed, the Punic line retreated, with Romans pursuing them. The third squadron was the slowest of the lot, and together with the Triarii fell behind. When the Romans were separated enough, Hamilcar sent a signal and the Carthaginians turned around and attacked the Romans. The Carthaginians were faster and could easily engage and fall back as needed, while the Romans had strength on their side. Any ship successfully hit with the Corvus was as good as gone. While this engagement was raging on, the Carthaginian flanks didn't stand by idly. Hanno with his faster ships on the right enveloped the Romans and attacked the Triarii. At the same time, the Punic left formed a solid line and rushed to meet the third squadron. Panicking, they abandoned the horse transports and engaged the Carthaginians. Hamilcar's plan worked as intended, the fleets were split and the battle turned into 3 separate engagements. Although the battle was fought on Hamilcar's terms, the Roman Corvus would prove insurmountable yet again. With both consuls fighting in the thick of things, the Romans were encouraged to stand their ground. Although the Carthaginians had some limited success with rammings, the sheer amount of ships present nullified this advantage. In time, the Punic resolve wavered and they fled from the scene. Lucius started gathering captured ships and securing them, while his colleague Marcus turned to help the rest of the fleet. The third and fourth Roman squadrons had much less success than the first 2, and they were on the brink of collapse. He first engaged Hanno and his ships. The Triarii were reinvigorated when they saw Carthaginians engaged from the back. They too pressed forth, and Hanno with the remnants of his fleet was put to flight. The Romans now rushed together to aid the third squadron. Lucius had by now secured the ships and he too was rushing in. The third squadron was pressed against the shore, unable to move. They would have surely been completely destroyed, but the fear of the Corvus held the Carthaginians at bay and they refused to engage. Rushing in from all sides, the Romans surrounded what was left of the Punic fleet. 50 ships were captured, with only a few strugglers managing to slip out. The greatest fleet the Carthaginians ever assembled was shattered within an afternoon. The way was now open for the Romans to invade North Africa and bring the fight to their enemy. The Battle of Cape Ecnomus, possibly the largest naval battle in history, has thus ended. Out of the 350 Carthaginian ships, more than 30 were sunk, with a further 64 captured. Out of the 330 Roman ships, only 24 were lost, none of them captured. It's unknown how many men died on either side. It speaks volumes that the Roman commanders could effectively control the large fleet and maneuver it around in the later stages of the battle. Their actions prevented a disaster waiting to happen behind them. In contrast, after the initial plan of false retreat, Hamilcar had little influence on the actions of his fleet. Although the plan was executed perfectly at the beginning, the Carthaginians had no answer to the Roman corvus. If the 3rd Squadron had fallen early, the reinforcement from the Carthaginian left would have spelled disaster for the Romans. It's entirely possible that these large and cumbersome fleets were more suited for the corvus and Roman boarding actions than to the skillful maneuvering of the Carthaginians. The fact that not one Roman ship was captured is evidence enough that the Carthaginian ships carried fewer soldiers on deck. Once the chorus struck, it spelled the end for the Punic crew. The 3 parts of the Carthaginian navy sailed off in different directions, leaving them unable to pose any further resistance. The Romans came ashore in Sicily, stopping to rest their men, replenish the supplies, and fix any damaged ships. When the fleet was finally ready, they set sail for Africa. They encountered no resistance during the crossing, and they landed on Cape Bon near the city of Aspis. The Romans dragged their ships onto land and built a fortified camp around them. When this was done, they besieged Aspis and took it with ease. The consul sent news of the events to the Senate, set up a garrison in Aspis, and proceeded to plunder the surrounding areas. These were some of the most fertile lands in Carthaginian possession, and the Romans gathered large amounts of plunder, capturing 20,000 slaves in the process. A message came from the Senate ordering one consul to return the navy to Rome and the other to stay with the army. Vulso took back the bulk of the ships along with the spoils and captured slaves, while Regulus stayed behind with the army. He was left with 15,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, and 40 ships at his disposal. The Carthaginians panicked when they realized that the legions were here to stay. They assembled all the available forces in Carthage. Hasdrubal, the son of Hanno, and Bostar were elected generals, while Hamilcar was recalled from Sicily. The 3 generals held joint control of the army, and following Hasdrubal's directions, they set off to stop the Romans from ravaging the countryside. While the Carthaginians were preparing their defenses, Regulus was capturing one town after another until he reached Adis. Adis was the first larger and better fortified city on their way, and the Romans began constructing siege engines. When the Carthaginian force reached them, they encamped on a small nearby hill. Polybius is highly critical of this move, as positioning themselves on a hill nullified their greatest advantages: cavalry and war elephants. Regulus must have realized this mistake and chose to capitalize on it. In the night he ordered his men to march on the Carthaginian camp from 2 sides. At daybreak the attack from one side started. As predicted, the cavalry and the elephants were completely useless on the uneven terrain, but the mercenaries were more than a match for the legions. They fought off the attack and pursued the fleeing legions, but they were attacked from the rear by the other part of the Roman army. Seeing the group of mercenaries destroyed, the rest of the Punic army broke and fled to safety. The Romans followed up their success by taking Tunis and turning it into a raiding base. While this Roman invasion was taking place in the east, the Carthaginians had further trouble in the west. The war with the Numidian princes was not going in their favor, and a large number of refugees from both sides flooded the city. Carthaginians, now twice defeated both on sea and on land, opened peace negotiations. Polybius claims that it was Regulus who initiated the talks, hoping to end the war before his year in office expired, but other ancient sources don't agree with this. Regulus proposed a ludicrous string of demands on the Carthaginians, which included abandoning Sicily and Syracuse, paying war reparations and an annual tribute, and limiting the navy to only one warship. Dio Cassius presents these terms, but considering that sources predating him, including Polybius, don't mention them, they are dubious at best. These demands were akin to an unconditional surrender, but although Carthage was bested in the field, they were far from total defeat. The terms were of course rejected, and in the winter of 255 the Carthaginians rebuilt their force, this time employing a number of Greek mercenaries. Among these Greeks was a man called Xantippus. He was a Spartan-trained mercenary leader with considerable experience. Upon hearing what had happened at Adis, he criticized the Carthaginian commanders. These comments reached the ears of the generals, and he was summoned to explain himself. Xantippus told them that their greatest power was the cavalry and elephants. This advantage could only be exploited if the Carthaginians stayed on open fields and engaged the Romans on such favorable terrain. Seeing the wisdom in his words, Xantippus was entrusted with the command of the army. At once he implemented a stricter training regiment, and the quality of the army along with their morale was improved considerably. After he estimated that the army was ready, he marched out of the city with 12,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and nearly 100 war elephants. When the Romans saw this army marching on open fields, they were surprised but eager for another fight. The two armies encamped near each other. Men in the Punic camp, now completely embracing Xanthippus as their leader, were loudly calling for a battle. For his part, Xanthippus urged the three generals to not waste this opportunity, and on the next day they took to the field. The Romans gladly answered, and the Battle of Tunis started. The Carthaginian infantry consisted of a citizen militia that formed a Greek-style phalanx. They were placed in the center and formed the core of the army. The rest of the infantry were the mercenaries who were placed on their right. The cavalry was split between the two wings. And finally, utilizing their full potential, the war elephants were positioned in front of the infantry in a single line. However, this line of elephants didn't cover the entire infantry, and the mercenaries on the right had a clear path to the Romans. Xanthippus is given the full credit for this formation. On the other side, the Romans formed into a modified triple-line formation, with what little cavalry they had divided between the wings. Polybius mentions that the legions were formed many maniples deep, but it's unclear what he really meant by this. Some authors interpret this as the Roman forming into more than the three usual lines, but this is unlikely. A more probable explanation is that each of the three standard lines was packed into more ranks than usual. The greatest threat that the war elephants posed was to the wavering morale of the front line. Seeing a giant beast charging towards you was more than enough to break even the heartiest of men. Thus, a deeper formation made it harder for the men in the first line to escape, and they held their ground. The battle started with Xanthippus ordering an elephant charge. The weakest part of the Roman army was the cavalry on the wings, and they were quickly put to flight by the Carthaginians, who outnumbered them at least 4-1. The Roman left avoided the elephant charge, and they clashed with the mercenaries. They were quickly broken and pursued all the way to the camp. In the meantime, the Roman right stood their ground against the elephant charge, but many men were killed and trampled trying to fight off this onslaught. Few of the Roman maniples managed to pass through the elephants, but already exhausted, they were struck down by the citizen phalanx. Their day turned from bad to worse when the Carthaginian cavalry charged them from the rear. The Romans, stuck between the hammer and an anvil, were utterly destroyed. Regulus and a small contingent of 500 men managed to break through the Punic ranks and make their escape, but they were quickly captured. Out of the approximately 15,000 Romans, only 2,000 men, who made the initial breakthrough on the left, survived and retreated to Aspis. Polybius mentions that 800 mercenaries died, but doesn't provide the numbers for the rest of the Carthaginian force. The Battle of Tunis was the single greatest use of elephants in battle during the whole of the Punic Wars. They not only won the day, but had a great psychological effect on the Romans, who avoided open conflict in Sicily at all costs. In the aftermath of the battle, Xanthippus left Carthage and went on to serve under Ptolemies in Egypt. It's unclear precisely why he left, but it's believed that jealousy from his Punic counterparts had a role to play in his exile. Here we come to another instance of mythical Roman storytelling. According to one tradition, Regulus was sent to Rome to negotiate the ransom of the prisoners, but he was oath-bound to return. He urged the Senate to refuse the terms and return to Carthage, knowing full well what awaited him there. Another source claims that his wife was given 2 prominent Carthaginian prisoners, whom she tortured as retribution. All of these claims were probably made after his death, in order to build a myth around the famous family member. By our best account, he probably died of natural causes in captivity. The Romans, hearing the news of the disaster in Libya, sent a fleet in 255 to rescue their men from Aspis. 350 Roman ships with more than 300 transports sailed from Sicily, but they were intercepted by 200 Carthaginian quinqueremes. The Punic fleet was easily defeated and 114 ships were captured. The fleet proceeded to Aspis and evacuated the men stationed there. The whole fleet, now numbering 464 ships, sailed to Sicily without interruptions. The consuls decided to parade their fleet off the coast of Sicily in hopes of encouraging hostile cities to switch sides. This was against the advice of senior naval officers who warned of sudden storms that time of year. Their warnings were ignored and the fleet was caught in a terrible storm off the coast of Camarina in mid-July. Out of the 464 warships, 384 were sunk, along with 300 troop transports. Actually, the ancient sources don't completely agree on the true number of ships, but this was without a doubt one of the greatest naval disasters in history. It's estimated that 25,000 soldiers and 70,000 sailors perished. The sinking of the ships is often blamed on the Corvus. The heavy drawbridge secured to the front of the ships must have made the whole thing unstable. After this disaster, there is no mention of corvus being used anymore, but it's entirely possible that they were not removed immediately, but rather phased out gradually. The Carthaginians, reinvigorated by their victory and this great disaster, started the construction of a new fleet. Hasdrubal and his army, along with 140 war elephants, were sent to Sicily. They arrived safely to Lilybaeum, and Hasdrubal took to drilling the army, no doubt learning a thing or two from his Greek counterpart. The next year, in 254 BCE, the Romans rebuilt their fleet. The consul Scipio Asina, who has the honor of the first Roman naval defeat of the war, and Aulus Atilius Caeatinus, took the new fleet numbering 220 ships and sailed off to Messana. There they linked up with the land armies and the 80 or so ships that survived the storm. Together, these two forces marched on Panormus and took it after breaching the outer walls. Tyndaris and much of the cities in inland western Sicily now sided with the Romans. From here, the land activity in Sicily died down. Although Hasdrubal tried to force the conflict with the Romans on several occasions, they refused to engage as the threat of war elephants still loomed large. The Romans exploited their superiority at sea and in 253 launched a series of raids on the African coast. The raids were successful and the ships laden with plunder returned, first to Sicily and then to Italy. On their way to Rome, the fleet was caught in yet another storm and 150 ships were sunk. These disasters were too much even for the Roman Senate, and they had to scale back on their naval ambitions. For a time, the remaining ships were used only as support for the land forces, but this state of affairs wouldn't last for long as the Romans would soon return to building new ships. In 252, two Punic strongholds, Thermae and Lipara, now isolated after the fall of Panormus, were captured. Seeing that their Sicilian possessions were shrinking by the day, Hasdrubal decided to act. In the winter of 251, one of the Roman consuls returned to Rome with half of the army, while the other was wintering in Panormus. When Hasdrubal learned of this, he brought the whole of his force to Panormus. The Carthaginians ravaged the fields around the city, and when they crossed the river close to Panormus, the Romans formed outside of the walls to meet them. A great number of skirmishers were placed in trenches around the city, and the citizens were ordered to supply them with missiles. When the elephants approached this trench, they were showered with missiles from all sides. Although they couldn't really hurt the elephants, the skirmishers succeeded in scaring them off. They turned around in a frenzy and rushed away from the Romans, stampeding right through the friendly line, trampling a great deal of men. The Romans now rushed out and defeated the remaining Carthaginians. There are no credible sources on the number of casualties in this battle. Some later authors claim that the Carthaginians lost 20 to 30,000 men, but this has to be a gross exaggeration. Polybius claims that in the aftermath of the battle, the Romans captured all Carthaginian elephants commanded by Hasdrubal. After the battle, the Romans were reinvigorated once more. Having conquered their fear of elephants, they were now on the offensive. In 250 BCE, the Romans led a combined land and naval force to Lilybaeum. Diodorus claims that the Romans numbered a combined 110,000 men. On their march west, they captured the remaining Punic holdouts on the island, reducing them to only two strongholds in the far west, Lilybaeum and Drepana. By this stage of the war, the Romans mastered the art of siegecraft, and from the onset, they constructed great siege engines that wouldn't be out of place in the Hellenistic world. For their part, the Carthaginians mounted a great defense of the city. Leader of the garrison, Hamilco, commanded a force of 10,000 mercenaries. Rather than wait for the Romans to breach the walls and storm the city, the defenders took proactive measures. They would tunnel under the walls to undermine the siege engines, perform nighttime raids to burn the exposed equipment, and carry out a host of other necessary precautions. Although heavily outnumbered, the small Carthaginian garrison would hold out until the very end of the war. The land forces were thus locked in a standstill, and all the action was again back on the seas. At the start of the siege, the Roman fleet blockaded the port of Lilybaeum, knowing that the only way of taking the city was starving it out. 50 ships were sent from Carthage to aid the city. They sailed to Agatis Islands and there waited for an opportune moment. When the favorable winds arose, the fleet sailed right past the Roman patrol and into the harbor. The fleet brought in 10,000 fresh troops along with the much-needed supplies. The sailors were not brazen enough to attempt this again, and they waited for the cover of darkness to leave the city, bringing the cavalry with them. The Romans, now on high alert, prevented any further large-scale resupply missions. At this time, Hannibal the Rhodian rose to the occasion and single-handedly evaded the Roman patrol and entered Lilybaeum. He used the same tactic as the previous fleet. He stationed himself on the Aegatis Islands and when the winds were in his favor, sailed into the harbor in full view of the Romans. 10 of the fastest Roman ships were positioned at the entrance to the port, hoping to catch the Rhodian. The next day, he left the port as if the Romans weren't there at all. Sailing past them, Hannibal wasn't content with simply evading the Romans, but he was bent on humiliating them as well. He stopped his ship a short distance away and dared the Romans to chase after him. None of the 10 ships dared to move, and Hannibal sailed off to safety. This little stunt emboldened other skilled Punic captains, and they would periodically enter the town bringing news and fresh supplies. The Romans threw large boulders and debris into the sea, hoping to block the passage. One of the quicker Punic quadriremes ran aground on this debris, and it was captured by the Romans. The Romans then used this fast ship to finally catch the Rhodian and his ship. These 2 exceptionally well-made Punic ships were then used to finally seal off the entrance to Lilybaeum. The Romans now decided to launch a surprise attack on the other Carthaginian stronghold in Sicily, Drepana. Publius Claudius Pulcher was elected consul for the year 249 BC. He was the grandson of the famous Appius Claudius Caecus, who built the Appian Way and opposed peace with Pyrrhus of Epirus in his old age. Claudius sailed the fleet north from Lilybaeum, hoping to surprise the Carthaginians. Before the battle, he consulted the sacred chickens, as was customary in the Roman world. The chickens were given food but refused to eat. This was an obvious bad omen, and Claudius should have abandoned the attack, at least for that day. Furious, he threw the sacred chickens off board, proclaiming, "If they are not hungry, maybe they are thirsty." The gods would not suffer such insults being hurled at the sacred chickens, and the Romans were punished with a great naval disaster. Claudius led his fleet to Drepana, hoping to trap the enemy fleet, but they were spotted. Adherbal, the Punic admiral, set a trap and waited for the Romans to close in. In front of the harbor, there were a couple of small islands, making 2 narrow corridors, one to the left and one to the right. When the Romans entered one of these corridors, the whole of the Punic fleet rushed out through the second corridor. Realizing what had happened, the Romans tried to maneuver their ships and form a solid line facing the Carthaginians. But the Punic ships were faster and had better crews. Adherbal sailed at the head of the fleet and enveloped the Romans, pinning them to the shore. Carthaginians finally utilized their naval superiority and crushed the Roman fleet. Claudius was on one of the rare ships that managed to escape. 93 Roman ships were captured along with their crews. Polybius makes no mention of the Corvus, and it's possible that the Roman ships didn't use it in this battle. The Punic ships were not afraid to charge in between the Romans, and this could be a sign that the ravens were not present on board. The recent disasters on the sea might have discouraged the Romans from using them. When he returned to Rome, Claudius was put on trial for his reckless actions, and he barely escaped with his life, only having to pay a hefty fine. After winning their first big naval engagement of the war, the Carthaginians were now on the offensive. Carthalo, another Punic admiral, sailed to Sicily with 70 new ships from Carthage. He was reinforced by Adherbal with a further 30 ships. With this fleet, he sailed to Lilybaeum and there destroyed most of the ships maintaining the blockade. After this success, he sailed on along the Sicilian shore, hoping to intercept the Roman fleet. The Romans, unaware of the recent disasters, sent a fleet of 120 warships and 800 transports to resupply the besiegers of Lilybaeum. The fleet had trouble crossing into Sicily and they split apart. The consul sent quaestors with half the transports and a few warships ahead, while he stayed behind in Syracuse waiting for the stragglers to catch up. After sailing a good distance from the main body of the fleet, the quaestors got word of the Punic ships headed their way. They lacked the strength to face them or the speed to outrun them. The only option they had left was to come ashore and build defenses around the ships. The Romans took catapults from a nearby town and positioned them around the ships. These rudimentary fortifications were enough to deter the Carthaginians from engaging, and they continued on their way. The consuls, with the rest of the fleet, set off from Syracuse. They rounded the Cape Aquinas and stumbled upon the Carthaginian fleet. He was unwilling to engage them, so he sailed close to the rugged coast of Sicily. Carthalo didn't follow him but watched from a distance. The Punic fleet was full of experienced captains who knew these waters. When they noticed that a storm was brewing, they advised Carthalo to sail around the cape and he agreed, leaving the Romans in perilous waters. A great storm arose and completely destroyed both parts of the fleet. This disaster was more complete for the Romans than the previous ones. After their first big naval defeat and another fleet lost to a storm, the Romans completely abandoned all action at sea. It's likely that Rome lacked funds to build yet another fleet, and they were again locked into fighting on land. Even though they now lacked naval support, the Romans didn't abandon the siege of Lilybaeum. The city was again easily resupplied by sea, and it would stand until the end of the war. To save face, the consul who lost the fleet led an attack on Mount Eryx, the second tallest mountain on Sicily. There the Carthaginians held the grandest and richest of all the Greek temples on the island. Eryx was captured and a Roman garrison was installed. It is now that the most famous general of the war took command of the Carthaginian army. In the year 247 BCE, the Carthaginians sent Hamilcar Barca into Sicily. Hamilcar is one of the greatest Carthaginian commanders, second only to his son Hannibal. Although he is mostly known for his actions after the war, he still had a part to play in this conflict. Upon taking command of the fleet, he raided both Locri and the southern tip of Italy. Satisfied with the collected booty, he made landfall in Sicily. He and his small force occupied Mount Pellegrino, a hill near Panormus, deep inside enemy territory. From there, Hamilcar launched frequent hit-and-run attacks on the Roman garrison. Meanwhile, the authorities in Carthage were now shifting their focus from Sicily to North Africa. The Numidian princes were once again rising up in revolt against Carthaginian rule. Hanno the Great, who was against the war with Rome from the very beginning, now held sway over the Senate. Hanno had considerable holdings in North Africa and Iberia, and he was in favor of continuing the westward expansion of Carthage. Because of him, Hamilcar was given only a small army and no funds to hire additional mercenaries. The Punic navy was also gradually withdrawn from Sicily, leaving Hamilcar stranded on the island. Interestingly, Hanno led the anti-war faction during the Second Punic War, and he was the main reason Hannibal received no support from Carthage while in Italy. Likewise, in Rome, the people were getting tired of the war. Countless lives and funds were poured into this conflict with only limited success. The Gauls were again stirring in the north, and Roman efforts in Sicily were dwindling. It was in this reduced capacity that Hamilcar Barca harassed the Romans for 3 years. He was mostly successful but lacked the manpower for any meaningful gains. In 244 BCE, Hamilcar saw the opportunity and recaptured Eryx, turning it into a new base of operations. This position was less defensible than his previous base, but nevertheless he successfully held out for another 3 years, inflicting further damage to the Romans. The two sides were thus locked in a standstill, and the Romans realized that they would have to take to the seas once more. After so many ships were lost, first at sea, then at the hands of the Carthaginians at Drepana, the Roman treasury was completely empty. Fortunately, the patriotic Roman citizens stepped forth and funded the construction of a brand new fleet. The wealthiest citizens paid for construction and equipment of 200 quinqueremes in total, hoping to be repaid after the war was concluded. According to reports, this loan was interest-free, meaning that the Roman elites really did see themselves as an extension of the state. Although Polybius claims this fleet consisted of quinqueremes or fives, it was most likely constructed by copying the design of captured quadrireme, or four. The captured ship in question is the one sailed by Hannibal the Rhodian at Lilybaeum. It was chosen for its sleeker design and higher speed. These ships were of exceptionally good quality. Years of making new fleets from scratch made the Roman shipbuilders masters of their crafts. When the fleet was ready in 242 BCE, the Romans sailed to Sicily under the command of the consul admiral Gaius Lutatius Catulus. Their first order of business was cutting the supply lines to Hamilcar's forces, leaving him in a precarious position. Catulus desired a great sea battle with the Carthaginians, believing that was the only way of truly defeating them. He took great care to exercise his men, leading them to sea every day. The men were given extra rations to keep them in great shape. By 241 BCE, the fleet was in supreme condition. It was by far the greatest fleet yet assembled by the Romans. When the Carthaginians heard the news of this fleet, they had to act. Considering that the Carthaginian navy had been out of service for the past few years, it took them some time to muster the 250 ships. Experienced sailors weren't readily available, so the ships were manned by fresh recruits. It's also possible that the ships were understaffed. Command of the navy was given to Hanno, possibly the one who suffered prior defeats in Agrigentum and Ecnomus. His ships were loaded with grain, and his main task was to reach Sicily and resupply the armies there. He would then take Hamilcar and his men on board and attack the Romans. Hanno led his fleet to Aegatis Islands and there waited for favorable winds, hoping to slip into Lilybaeum unnoticed. However, Catulus got word of this. He took additional men on board to serve as marines and rushed to the Aegatis Islands. The two fleets were anchored off neighboring islands, facing each other. On the 10th of March 241 BCE, favorable winds arose from the west and the Carthaginians set sail for Lilybaeum. Catulus was now presented with a difficult decision. If he engaged the Carthaginians, his men would have to fight the rough seas in addition to enemy vessels. But if he let them pass, the ships would be boarded with the best troops Hamilcar had on hand. Catulus chose to trust in the training of his men, and he sent a signal to engage. The Carthaginians answered by forming up in a line ready to fight. For the first time in the war, the Romans had better trained sailors and faster, more maneuverable ships. This discrepancy was soon evident and the Punic fleet was crushed. Luckily, during the battle the wind changed direction, allowing the surviving Carthaginians to escape. The Romans sank 50 Punic ships and captured a further 70, while they lost 30 with another 50 crippled. 10,000 Carthaginians were captured, a relatively small amount considering the number of captured ships. This could be evidence that the Punic ships were understaffed. Defeat at the Battle of Agatis Islands was one too many for the Carthaginians, and they had to sue for peace. Polybius claims that they lacked funds for constructing a new fleet, and without a fleet, their armies in Sicily couldn't hold out for much longer. Hamilcar, who hadn't lost a single battle, was given full authority to negotiate peace with the Romans. In the end, it was agreed that the Carthaginians would completely abandon Sicily and all the islands between it and Africa, return all Roman prisoners for free while ransoming their own, and pay an indemnity to Rome. 1,000 talents were to be paid immediately, with a further 2,200 over the next 10 years. For comparison, some estimates put the cost of the 20,000-strong Carthaginian mercenary army at around 2,000 talents a year. Suddenly, the war that raged on for 24 years was now finally over. The First Punic War was by far the largest and the most expensive war the Romans fought up to that point. Census figures in Rome show that the population of the city was reduced by 50,000, or about 17%, during the course of the war. These figures only account for the citizens of Rome itself. Countless more allies have perished in this prolonged conflict. According to Polybius, the Romans lost about 700 ships, mostly in storms, while the Carthaginians lost around 500. As we have already mentioned, these numbers are somewhat disputed, but in any case the number of lost ships and sailors were staggering. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, put it bluntly: "It is the longest, the most continuous, and the greatest conflict that we have knowledge of." In the end, the Romans achieved their ultimate goal, gaining complete control over Sicily. While fighting wars in Italy, the Romans would usually absorb the conquered people, sometimes giving them Roman citizenship and usually leaving them to their own devices. These conquered people then had one simple but important obligation: providing men for the Roman army. Sicily was far too large and distant to apply the same principles of conquest. Instead, Sicily became the first Roman province, or a territory outside Italy under Rome's direct rule. In contrast to Italian allies, the provinces didn't have to provide men for the army, but rather pay taxes to Rome. Governors were appointed periodically to rule over the provinces and extract taxes from their respective territories. Soon the grain coming in from Sicily became a major source of food for Rome itself, making many aristocrats in charge of its distribution exceptionally wealthy. Control of Sicily brought with it control of the sea routes, and after the war, the Romans emerged as the de facto rulers of the Western Mediterranean. Naval experience gained through the war would later play a crucial part in the Roman expansion out of Italy. The foundations of Roman dominance over the Mediterranean for the next 600 years were laid in these hard years. During the war, the Romans once again showed their capacity for aggressive action. An entire army lost in Africa, 3 fleets completely destroyed by storms, and 1 fleet lost in battle did nothing to deter the Romans from prosecuting the war. In the ancient world, only one of these disasters would be enough to convince any sensible nation to sue for peace. But the Romans were far from sensible. As we have seen time and time again, and as we will see countless more times in this series, the loss of an entire army was just a small setback for the Romans. They wouldn't even stop to mourn their losses, but simply raise another army. These armies would keep coming until their enemy had to sue for peace from sheer exhaustion. On the other hand, the Carthaginians were willing to endure this, but only to a point. Losses on the ground were suffered by the mercenaries and not the citizens of Carthage. This allowed the generals to lose countless men without raising alarm back at home. But losses to their fleet were the one thing the Carthaginians could not bear. Loss of ships meant a loss of trading profits, and when the war started hurting the income of the rich elites, it was time to end it. For his loyalty and service during the war, Hiero was promised a lifetime alliance with Rome. Syracuse and its zone of influence were now firmly under Roman protection. After the war, Hamilcar Barca left Sicily, leaving the Carthaginians to deal with the unpaid mercenaries. They ignored the first rule of dealing with the mercenaries and refused to pay them what was owed. This foolish decision resulted in a ruthless civil war that lasted 3 years and cost Carthage far more than the initial owed sum. This war was fought with unrivaled brutality, and Polybius called it the Truceless War. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Romans were now in a much better position. Indemnity paid by the Carthaginians was used to pay off the debt incurred by the construction of the latest fleet. The Romans would go on to use their newly gained naval supremacy to expand their influence over the Mediterranean. They conquered Sardinia and Corsica in the west and destroyed the Illyrian pirates in the east. Victories on sea were then followed by the victories on land, and the Romans finally crushed the Celts in the north and expanded their territory to Cisalpine Gaul. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Barcid family expanded Carthaginian territory in Iberia. This expansion set them on an inevitable course towards the Second Punic War. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. We hope you liked it. If you enjoy our videos, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support will help us make even more videos in the future.